So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for returning from lunch for the continuation of our program. As we were assembling this program, we were trying to decide which side of the noon hour was more blessed, the morning when we had the secretary and the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee, or the afternoon where we have Anish Chopra, Howard Schmidt, Phil Reidinger, and other dignitaries. And we couldn't decide, so we'll leave it to you to decide. But we are definitely looking forward to stepping up the energy level this afternoon to keep everybody engaged. And there is no better person, if you've not met him, you will soon find out why. There is no better person to step up the post-lunch energy level than the U.S. government's CTO, Anish Chopra. Anish is not only CTO, but he's Associate Director for Technology in the White House's Office of Science, Technology, and Policy. He was sworn into this position May 22nd, 2009. Prior to his appointment, he served as Secretary of Technology for our local friends south of the border, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and he previously served as Managing Director with the Advisory Board Company, a publicly traded healthcare think tank. So that's the official bio. I think what's more impressive and more fun to talk about is the unofficial bio of Anish. I was just poking around on the web the other day, and somebody in the press referred to him as the George Clooney of CTOs. And I thought to myself, wow, that is a bizarre mashup. CTO, George Clooney. I think you'll find out why. He's dynamic, he's creative, telegenic for sure. But on a more serious note, I've had the opportunity to engage Anish in different tech policy discussions throughout the administration, although just some. He is ubiquitous. He has got a finger in a lot of the pots that involve technology and technology policy for the United States. He is the manifestation of why many of us who joined the Obama administration know in our heart of hearts that this administration gets it when it comes to tech, because he certainly gets it and he lets you know it. So without further ado, Anish Chopra.
Thank you. That's funny. Thank you, Mark. I am thankful to Mark for the introduction, and I'm even more thankful for the chance to share a few words in front of Vint Cerf. Guruji, how are you, man? How are you? How do we do this? This is odd. Okay. Listen, my job today, Howard and I had lunch yesterday, and I was chatting him up about this. Howard's going to give you the framework for cybersecurity policy in the administration. But I thought what I might do is provide for you the context for how cybersecurity fits into a larger message and frame around our technology and innovation agenda. So you're going to hear several versions of our focus. Mine will be more on the frontier land, if you will, and Howard will provide much more of the context for what we're doing operationally in the here and the now. And so we'll juxtapose the messages, and I look forward to your feedback on how productive that conversation has been for all of you. So I want to begin with, in the spirit of Vint, one of the Google employees, a young lady named Katie Stanton, came to work for the administration. And Katie was part of a broad range of folks that came into the administration from Silicon Valley or from entrepreneurial backgrounds. And early in Katie's tenure, she remarked in such an eloquent way sort of set of messages that I thought were pertinent to the discussion about the world we've come into. And that was the culture gap that we're seeing between our private lives and our public sector. And her basic and most astute point was that she had come from a world where there was an app for that, but when she entered into Washington, she quickly acknowledged that there was a different environment here, one where there's a form for that. And what you see graphically is the file cave that has personnel records in the mountains of Pennsylvania for the Office of Personnel and Management. Is OPM in the house? Where's my OPM brothers and sisters? Okay, maybe not. Well, as you can imagine, what's even more troubling about that graphic is that we have pictures of this in government buildings around the country. We have reports that fire marshals have actually come in and said because of the weight of the paper, this building must be evacuated or in some ways improved. It's astounding. Well, that's why the president said on his first full day in office, when he announced the concept of a chief technology officer, his first homework assignment was, in a sense, to close this gap, but in a part to do so by creating a government that was more open, more transparent, more collaborative. It's a vision that the president had taken further in September of last year when he announced the Strategy for American Innovation. Now, I have been talking about this strategy a great deal, but I want to make sure so that I don't get too in the weeds. By a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the president's Strategy for American Innovation? Half of you, okay? Let me see if I can provide the abridged version in this graphic that you see in front of you. In order to close that gap that Katie had described, the president said what we need to do are really three things in the long-term prospects for the American economy. And I say that proverbially at the anecdote earlier, but the three key elements of our long-term economic growth strategy. Element number one, which I'll highlight more in detail, is that we as a nation are at our best when we invest in the building blocks of innovation. And we view the building blocks in three domains: research and development, advanced information technology infrastructure, and human capital, or workforce training. The second pillar in the middle of this lovely pyramid is our commitment to promoting competitive and open markets with a particular emphasis on entrepreneurship. Here's where our open government philosophy really shines, and the flow of data that's so critical, which is in part the discussion that we're having today on cybersecurity and protection of that data. And then last but not least, the president identified a few key national priorities where we have to catalyze breakthroughs. Chief among them, the interface between information technology and the energy sector, specifically what we refer to as our smart grid, and the interface between information technology and our healthcare sector, our overall health IT agenda. It's no surprise to any of you that cybersecurity is a critical component in each of these domains. So let's get started with the base of that pyramid, the focus on research and development as an important enabler of our overall platform for economic growth. What you see graphically is the president's introduced budget in fiscal 11, that despite our overall freeze for non-security funding, the president reallocated funds to keep on his commitment to promote research and development, and actually increased R&D some 6.6% or so. We are on track to double the core budgets of the National Science Foundation, the Office of Basic Science at the Department of Energy, and NIST, who's one of our hosts today. A lot of love for you, Sita. So this trajectory, and you see that spike in the middle, the purple graphic, by the way, reflects the Recovery Act. And I think it's important to note that when the president spoke of the Recovery Act, he spoke of the need to include in the Recovery Act investments that would affect our long-term economic prospects. Chief among those long-term investments obviously were research and development investments at our science agencies, but also included in that were investments in health IT and the smart grid. I'll talk about that momentarily. But the president didn't want to stop at budget, because budget is only one way of thinking about our overall strategy. The other is making sure that we know where the puck is proverbially heading, in the spirit of Wayne Gretzky. And so to that end, the president tasked his external advisors, a group called PCAST, the President's Council of Advisors of Science and Technology, that includes a subcommittee on innovation and technology. In the world of acronyms, the subcommittee known as PTAC, that convened its first summit precisely to identify where the puck might be heading. In fact, we had identified the top under 35 researchers around the country in areas like nanotechnology, information technology, and biotechnology. And we brought them into Washington to say, over the next 10 years, what does the world look like if your research is successful? And more to the point, what are the critical enabling technologies or infrastructures that should be present in order to scale what might work if you are effective. By the way, all of that very gripping meeting is publicly available. If you visit ostp.gov and you click around PCAST Public Meeting Archives, you can watch this couple-hour, if you want to be inspired for a couple hours, sit and listen to these geniuses talk about the world as they envision it from the work that they're doing today. It is obvious when you listen to their remarks and you think about our overall agenda that cybersecurity is increasingly an important, if not critical, contribution at the interface of all of these traditional disciplines. We heard specific testimony in this session of a cybersecurity researcher, I believe at Carnegie Mellon, who spoke of the concerns as more and more of our healthcare devices are implanted with remote connectivity solutions that are to the good. If you have a heart attack, the systems can be trained to send a message to the device that would provide you a little electric impulse to keep your heart from stopping. But, as this researcher suggested, the same capabilities under a cyber attack could actually be used to manipulate whether such a device should act when it's not appropriate. So understanding the interface of cybersecurity and health, cybersecurity and energy, and so forth, a key theme that came out of our researcher roundtable. It's why Howard Schmidt and I, early in this, in our tenure together, made such a priority a deep dive on the research and development strategy for cybersecurity in this administration. How many of you, by a show of hands, have attended or read about the National Cyber Leap Year initiative that we had last August? A few of you. Actually, maybe 30% of you. Bless you. So much of our cybersecurity posture today, if I could overly simplify it, is playing this sort of bizarre perimeter fence defense, right? We're going to identify signatures that are bad, rapidly write patches, rapidly execute that they can be put out there into every PC in the country, and that we stand ready so that any of these bad things that come in will have that signature and we've stopped it. And we've got this incredible defense. We know at the pace at which new attack vectors are created, at some point this strategy is a difficult one to see scale. So one of the key insights that came out of the cybersecurity R&D game-changing work was how do we flip the equation? Not so much keeping the bad guys out, but from containing the damage that if they get in, they don't actually do us any harm. What an interesting and intriguing area of research. One of 3 areas that we believe are critical to identify breakthroughs or game changers as we look to cybersecurity. Second, in that publication, we focused on the notion of tailored, trustworthy spaces, a safe and secure internet within the internet. I guess I'm overly simplifying. But again, in the spirit, and I'll talk about specific initiatives that really exemplify what we're talking about here. How might we create a more secure home within the constraints of the internet or the openness of the internet to give us much more confidence in the work that's been done? And then last but not least, the notion of economic incentives. We've talked a great deal about the social and behavioral economics aspects of cybersecurity. There isn't a business today that doesn't have physical security outside. You all came into the Washington Reagan Center, and you all went through a security apparatus, physical in nature. There was no line item appropriation that gave people a plus up in their budgets for this, presumably, but it became the cost of doing business in the physical environment. And one of our key research questions is why and how might we make our cybersecurity protections a key component of our operational budgets. That is to say, how do we embody the right set of incentives so that we make this part of our routine investment. We, by the way, communicated to the American people in the spirit of openness in our government that we have heard from the Cyber Leap Year community, the 200+ people who attended, the documents that are publicly available for input. Howard and I announced in May that what we wanted to do was hear directly from others in the ecosystem who may not have physically been part of these other conversations to react to this agenda. Because we do have a commitment to seeing this agenda not only as a long-term R&D plan, but to demonstrate progress against that plan in the nearer term. And I'll give you some examples of that as I proceed. But the third leg of that infrastructure was acknowledging that we need a workforce that's prepared for the 21st century economy. That's why the president announced in November of last year the Educate to Innovate campaign. By the way, show of hands if you were familiar with the Educate to Innovate campaign. A number of you. For those of you in the private sector, we strongly encourage you to step up and participate in this initiative, entirely organized by and for the private sector. The president said that if we are to focus on the workforce of the future, it is obvious that we need much more training in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Not only if you want to be a cybersecurity professional, but also if you want to be engaged in almost any aspect of our economy. Any researcher will tell you, if you look at the jobs in our economy that require at least a baccalaureate degree, those numbers continue to go up dramatically in the out years. And if you think about the importance of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to the economy, you could see the gap has grown even larger still. So over $500 million of private philanthropy and private corporate investment has been put towards an advancement of a bottoms-up grassroots agenda for education focused on STEM. And I'm very pleased that a number of those initiatives are exposing folks to the challenges of cybersecurity. To the extent that any of you have ideas on what you would like to see introduced as part of this initiative, come forward. My favorite, just about 3 weeks ago, I was in Los Angeles for E3, which is the gaming convention. And I handed out the prizes, the checks, to entrepreneurs, young students, the whole gamut, who responded to Sony and Electronic Arts' collaboration with the MacArthur Foundation to build STEM-oriented levels in 2 games, Sony's Little Big Planet and EA's Spore. And that these competitors built levels into those games that would allow folks to learn while playing. And some of them were amazing. My favorite was, if you remember in science class how to create that volcano, that's pretty cool stuff, Vint. These guys created a way to make that volcano appear in the actual Little Big Planet, which I thought was pretty fun. So there could easily be, and we could execute this in weeks and months, not years, an interesting public-private collaboration on cybersecurity principles, whether it be in gaming or in some other domain, that would help to educate folks on the possibilities. So we talked about the R&D agenda. I must say a few words about IT infrastructure. This has been a very exciting couple of months in the tech team because of this president's actions to promote what I would call the doubling of critical IT infrastructure over the next 10 years. I'm going to highlight one example that makes it feel real to folks, and then I'll talk about the policy levers that we're pulling here. Idea number 1 has been the story of Case Western Reserve University's internally funded R&D effort to think about breakthroughs in connectivity. Case Western is on Internet 2, like most of our universities are. And they've internally financed a project to extend Internet 2 to 104 homes physically adjacent to the campus. And if you've been to Cleveland, you'll know that Case Western happens to be on one of the poorest communities in the country. And they asked a very bold question. What does a gigabit of connectivity do to transform everyday Americans, especially those who might be living at the bottom of our economic ladder? And in a sense, an inspiring call to entrepreneurs and innovators to bring their coolest applications that are not yet ready for prime time to this ecosystem for the purposes of demonstrating the game-changing effects. They announced, by the way, their first initiative in smart metering capabilities. So a gigabit of connectivity opens up possibilities in distance learning, possibilities in healthcare chronic disease management, again on energy management, and on issues of public safety. It's exciting to watch how entrepreneurs are working together on this infrastructure in a little town, in a little section of Cleveland. Imagine if this scaled to 40 or 50 cities from around the country, and we built a test bed, Vint Cerf, of 5,000 homes that could connect in some creative way to at least a gigabit of connectivity. I don't know what's possible, but I can tell you, as part of our exciting investments in BTOP, which is the President's broadband investment program led by our good friends at the Commerce Department, we announced just about a week and a half ago over $100 million of capital 3/4 of which financed by the government and 1/4 from the private sector, to essentially double the capacity of ultra-high-speed broadband networks. You might think of them as Internet 2 and Lambda Rail. But we will have a doubling, if you will, of the number of miles of connectivity that can have at least a gigabit of connectivity up to 100 gigabits of connectivity once this grant is fully implemented. So we're going to double up the capacity of those who can connect to ultra-high-speed broadband networks, and if those institutions that are connected can find their own resources, could extend this infrastructure and a research environment to their neighborhoods and allow us to create that testbed. Very exciting prospects. It's not just the wired environment, it's also the wireless environment. And so I highlight for you just a simple example of how we're leveraging wireless technology to improve the lives of everyday Americans. We announced in February the Text for Baby campaign. What a simple concept. In the midst of a reasonably vocal public discussion we had on health care, I don't know if you were following that particular piece of legislation, but while we were having that debate in Washington, we were executing on simple solutions that would help people in their daily lives. Oh, and by the way, we were doing so at a zero cost to the taxpayers and at a zero cost to the young family members who were involved. What do? We convened. We often forget about the role of government as convener. Now it's like government as budget financer or government as legal rule maker. But the notion of government as convener is often missed in these conversations. Government as convener in tech and innovation led to Text for Baby. A coalition of nonprofit organizations said, if a pregnant mom texts 511-411 and the word baby or bebe in Spanish and their expected due date, they can receive 3 personalized text messages a week. Oh, by the way, to convene, we had to call on the cell phone companies who said, we will waive our text message fees for 2 years to participate in this collaborative. It meant that we had to make sure the content sent to the moms met some peer-reviewed standard. So the Centers for Disease Control engaged with the Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies Coalition to ensure that the quality of content was sufficient. And it meant we've got to find a way to get the word out to folks. Medicaid centers from around the country stood up. My hometown of Virginia. In Richmond, Virginia, now the Medicaid program, for every new mom enrolled in Medicaid, and they often do because of their pregnancy, they receive in their enrollment package instructions on how to join Text for Baby. No surprise that with no money for marketing, no money for taxpayers, no money for anything formal, we've already hit 50,000 moms who are enrolled in the program. And I know it works because doctors have been calling me to say, Anish, I'm seeing an uptick in people coming in for prenatal care visits because they say, I got a text message, I got to come in for a prenatal care visit. And folks are starting to access the system. Hopefully over time this means we'll reduce our infant mortality rate or our preterm birth rate. What does this mean for the economy? That's why the president called for an unprecedented 10-year strategy to double our overall commitment to mobile broadband, to ensuring that over 500 megahertz of spectrum would be released and commercially auctioned to provide more broadband connectivity in this country. I'm very excited about the 10-year plan that the president unveiled. Larry Summers described this about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And again, in the spirit of our infrastructure, acknowledging both wired and wireless are critical, I'm particularly bullish on our wireless strategy, and we're starting to take this concept global. By the way, Text for Baby, Secretary Clinton announced, is now going to move to Russia next, and you're going to start to see a global movement for these kinds of simple solutions. It also is a spirit of open government that we're using technology, data, and innovation in so many of our daily lives. It was the First Lady who's called on our country to get a little bit smarter about childhood obesity. But how are we going to get smarter about childhood obesity? One of her 4 key principles in addressing this challenge is to close the information gap. Not all of us know the quality or the health nutrition value of the foods we're eating. So how do we close the nutrition gap? Well, in the Department of Agriculture, we have a database of 30,000 foods, and you can access it on myfoodipedia.gov. Anyone visited myfoodipedia.gov? Exactly. Well, by the way, I type in bagel with cream cheese, which is my breakfast, and it tells me I've consumed 68 excess calories. Interesting. But the point of this is that the data sits at myfoodipedia.gov. I don't even know if folks could spell myfoodipedia.gov, let alone know to visit that website. So what do? We released the data. And we found a whopping $60,000 in grant funds that we could make available as prize money. Whopping, right? But what does this mean? This means that Steve Wozniak says, I want to be a judge. It means that Mark Pincus of the coolest, hottest new internet company, Zynga, social gaming company, says, I want to be a judge. And we get all these folks who stand up and say, I want to participate in this movement. Over 160 games were produced in time for the deadline, of which 95 met the first initial criteria. Visit all of them at appsforhealthykids.com. And by the way, you're all allowed to vote because there's a popularity contest for the best apps wins one of the popularity prizes. Deadline is August 15th for the public voting. But again, I bring this up because you cannot think of any policy today that doesn't involve at least some data connectivity as part of our strategy, which, by the way, means we must also have a thoughtful approach on cybersecurity as more and more of our lives are digital. And that's a lot of what you're going to hear from Howard. Two final observations before I wrap up my remarks. It is important, as we look at the catalyzing effect we want to have in those two areas I cited earlier, smart grid and health IT, that we get these right from the beginning, not as an afterthought. Howard is my blood brother on the issues of cybersecurity in the smart grid and cybersecurity in health IT. Just to give you an example, in the smart grid, literally this summer, there are 3,000 homes in Massachusetts who are going to have a little box that will allow them to read in 6-second increments the meter that's already outside their home, but wasn't tuned in a radio frequency that would allow the public to read it. So we've got to figure out, okay, so we're going to get the, so what happens if you get the data, and by the way, when they get the data, it's fed into a system that has open APIs so that the data could be basically built on top of, and new apps could be created that will come up with creative ways of convincing me to be better about my energy usage. So understanding cybersecurity in the smart grid, it's why on June 8th we announced that the White House was going to convene a strategic review of smart grid. We've had a couple sessions at the Brookings Institution, one more tomorrow. We've had a cybersecurity deep dive. We will, over the coming months, put together a strategic roadmap for where we are on the Smart Grid Post-Recovery Act. Ditto on healthcare IT. I want to highlight one example, one project in particular that is, I think, a critical example of ensuring you bake cybersecurity principles on the front end. We held public testimony in the spirit of open government. We wanted to hear from doctors, not the lobbyists and not the insiders who can finance people to fly to Washington and sit in ballrooms and all the rest. We wanted to hear from people directly. And a doctor said to us, let me tell you my health IT problem. He was a Virginia doctor. He says, I have a patient moving to Arizona. The patient would like an electronic copy of her record sent to the doctor in Arizona, who, by the way, is on the same software that I'm on. And after we figured all this out, we said, oh, great, let's do it. There's no button that says send to my colleague in Arizona. So as an experiment with patient permission, the IT department exported the patient's record file, attached it to the public internet on regular email, sent it to Arizona, where the doctor opened up the file and imported it, and it worked. While the doctor's testifying, the room had a collective heart attack. We do not want to be using the public internet to be emailing back and forth sensitive patient medical records. So the doctor asked something very basic in his testimony. I'm sure you all are developing wonderful things and money will flow and processes will happen, but will you just make it safe and secure for me to email the data to my colleague? And we said, duh, absolutely. So within months, we stood up a voluntary collaborative project called the NHIN Direct. It was convened in March, and it had a very simple mission. Let's lock up, proverbially, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Epics, the ecosystem of 80-plus folks in the healthcare sector. Let's get them to establish a draft set of technical specs that would meet the doctor's call. And frankly, what that would mean is a way to achieve the meaningful use objectives, which is qualifying you for billions of dollars of reimbursement. Anyway, how do we get this up and running? In the spirit of rapid turns, because we don't have patience to think in budget cycles or government things of congressional involvement, we wanted to see results now. Within 90 days, this group achieved consensus and developed the protocols for safe, secure email transport. You are welcome to view and read and comment on these at nhindirect.org. But it's the spirit of achieving a lot of our policy objectives, embracing the spirit of voluntary consensus-driven standards making, encouraging through the convening power of the administration to get folks around the table to solve challenging problems, and ensuring that we bake cybersecurity principles on the front end before we move our overall health IT agenda forward. Again, I would welcome your input and reaction to this framework. There are now going to be prototypes developed this fall where folks are going to be exchanging information using these protocols, and my humble opinion, this is going to be the dominant method of exchange in the year 2011 when the first year of connectivity requirements hit under meaningful use. Which leads me to my final observation. My final observation is that, to put all of this together, we are now hitting a moment in time where we're sort of coming back to the past and thinking about the future. And I was really excited to share with you the final conclusions of the DARPA Red Balloon Challenge. Vint. In 40-year celebration, the folks at DARPA said, let's do something very interesting. And by the way, a $40,000 project for DARPA has to be considered in the lowest end of their investment cycle. But in the spirit of fast can-do government, when they announced our 40th anniversary celebrations, they said that in a couple months, this is in the fall, by December 5th, I think it was, we're going to put up the 10 balloons in undisclosed locations around the country and bring them down that same day. What you know, of course, is the story. I'm sure most of you now have read about this in the papers, that MIT team won. But I want to give you 3 takeaways of the experience. The MIT team that won decided to play the game 48 hours before the game started. In other words, a half a dozen postdocs and students sat around a proverbial conference table and said, how do we build a 1.5 million person global army to find 10 balloons, and oh, by the way, we'll organize this to happen in 2 days? Number one. Number two, what are the radical social and behavioral incentive programs we could introduce into this game to encourage the formation of that army? And as you read about in the papers, they had a very intriguing system. If Vint was lucky enough to find a balloon, he would get half the value of the balloon as a reward. If I invited Vint to join the network, I would get half of what Vint got. And if Danny invited me, who invited Vint, he'd get a quarter, and then an eighth. This tiered incentive system is what convinced everybody to join this ragtag bunch of geeks, presumably, I don't want to presume who they are, to engage in this really weird contest. And then that leads to the third point, which is once you turn somebody on to this exciting project, you can see the spillover effect. And it's the spillover effect that I want to use as my ending remarks. Spillover effect number one. The lead postdoc, Riley Crane, who was involved in this particular endeavor, was moved and said, I'm motivated by a cause greater than myself. He cared about the cause of global hunger. So he approached the UN, and he's formed and you can see the graphic, 1 billion people live in chronic hunger, and I'm mad as hell. A global petition using the same kind of tiered incentive strategy, where instead of getting cash incentives, you get sort of, reputation points. And has already led to hundreds of thousands of people that have signed on to his global petition. But the second output of this is that a group of folks from the MIT community have now commercialized this logic in a mobile commerce venture in Africa, where they've said, if you want to pay somebody for situational awareness, maybe it's to find out if there's a human rights abuse or something, we could create a payout model using mobile commerce that will reward people for reporting things that are of importance to somebody. So here you have a weird research project that has tested out a whole new methodology of incentives that's led to an exciting social endeavor, what we call e-democracy, and, by the way, an economic venture that will hopefully lead to job creation and the like. That's the spirit of the president's commitment to innovation. It's why we believe as more and more of our lives become digital, the cybersecurity question must follow right in step. And it's why I'm so pleased that I had the chance to speak before Howard is going to inspire you with the policies we have later today. Thank you for your time.